recommitting myself to the collective, to the practice, to the land has meant everything to me, has defined me as a human. I would have lost my sanity without that as my source of strength, as my source of connection.
Welcome to Spirit and Liberation, the podcast where we bridge the sacred and the political, where ancestral wisdom meets the front lines of organized movement. Every episode, we bring you into conversation with spiritual practitioners, political organizers, and healers who are weaving ancestral tradition into the work of liberation. We'll discuss everything from community-based care systems to the often unseen spiritual frameworks that accompany our movements. Whether you're a longtime student or initiate of African and Indigenous spiritual practices, or you're just starting to explore these paths, this space is for you. I am your host, and my name is Jeanette Charles Marquez, and I am an organizer, historian, and IFAP practitioner who is deeply committed to liberation. Today, we're in conversation with someone whose work calls us back to the wisdom and teachings of the trees, the soil, and the land itself, Zulayka Santiago. Zulayka describes herself as a daughter of the ocean, canepa trees, island breezes, and wild spaces. Born in Puerto Rico and raised in the U.S., Zulayka is a bridge between worlds, connecting cultural and ecological landscapes. She is a mother, a facilitator, and a guide for those seeking to reclaim their relationship to land, self, and community. Zulayka is a founding member of the Earthseed Land Collective, a space where land, spirit, and collective liberation converge. Over the past decade, Zulayka has practiced what it means to live in deep relationship with the land, tending to over 48 acres of land in North Carolina. Through this work, she invites others to reflect on how we might center land, spirit, and kinship in our movements for justice. That said, today's episode is about land ministry, not just living on the land, but living in sacred relationship with it. Zulayka will guide us through her practice of earth listening, a practice of deep presence and attention to the wisdom of elder trees, moss, birds, and all that lives around us. Her reflections challenge us to think about land not as a commodity or resource, but as a living kin who holds memory, guidance, and healing potential for us all. Thank you so much, Zulayka, for making the time today. We had the pleasure of spending significant time together this past year through the program of Spirit and Liberation. How did this experience help define or expand your understanding of what liberation work looks like, especially in relation to Ifa Orisha and other spiritual traditions and frameworks?
I will start off by saying that I did feel like one of the outliers in the program, and that Ifa Orisha is not my individual spiritual path, and my exposure to that cosmology, to that world, definitely expanded my felt sense of liberation, coming to understand more and more that liberation has to be an embodied experience, and that part of that embodiment needs to live in a collective form. I think that's one of the biggest gifts of this program for me. I'm still slowly, and maybe will be for years, unpacking the implications of that in my own life and the ripple effects of that. But overall, it helped me deepen the understanding of liberation from my head and my heart into like a full body experience.
I'm wondering for you how, speaking on this piece of embodiment, is how you feel like you're able to, or currently embodying, different spiritual systems and practices in your own daily life and organizing life.
My primary spiritual practice, I would say, is one of being in open-hearted apprenticeship relationship with the more than human world. and learning more and more what it means to be an interspecies liaison and stepping away from the human supremacist framework that is so prevalent in my life, in our lives, especially here in the United States. And so what that means concretely is going into the woods and practicing earth listening, sitting with a humble and open heart and listening to the wisdom of the elder trees, of the birds, of the moss, of the insects, and really learning to just quiet my brain and then figuring out how to carry that kind of presence and that kind of felt sense of interconnection into the rest of my day, into the rest of my life. I would say that is my primary spiritual practice, and it still feels like a very, I wouldn't say individual, because again, it's a connection into a greater kinship beyond just as humans. But because it is one human in the midst of all of that, it still feels there's still a learning edge there for me about how to then bring that back into my circle of human family, especially because it's not something that I am practicing with my immediate family necessarily. Some of it I do practice with extended family. But having the Brazil experience, the Tejedo experience, the Candomblé experience, where it was such a collectively held practice, I returned home wondering how I could explore that more in my own life.
In this kind of process of exploration, are there more recent lessons or experiences that you've had that you see unraveling a little bit coming out from that?
The result of this presidential election in the US and then everything else that it has revealed. I keep saying that it's not so much that it's been a surprise, yet it has been revelational. It has brought me to question what is at the core of all of this. Yes, it's neoliberalism and colonialism, but those still feel like superficial answers. And what I've come to is that at the core of it is that same disconnection between us humans and the rest of existence, the rest of all of the other living beings that call this place home. And so that disconnection, that fracture has created so many other ripple effects that we are now experiencing on so many different levels. So the night after the election, what we did was gather at Earthseed around a fire, and we, put the call out to a few of the folks in the community to just come sit with us in our grief, like in our trauma. It felt like we were just holding this collective trauma and not even finding the words, not knowing what to do with it. But in our intuition, knowing that this ancestral technology of coming together and sitting around the fire and just having space to hold it, whatever it is, together, is one of the ways that we make sense, that we move forward.
I'm glad that you mentioned the work at Earthseed. During the program, we talked a lot about, and we're in community with folks around questions of land and land stewardship. And so I'm wondering if you can also speak into that a little bit more about what is the work at Earthseed and about how land stewardship and being in relationship with the land is also a part of this bigger picture of liberation work.
In my perspective, it is everything. It is so integral. And especially given what I just shared about how I define my own spiritual practice, is that for so many years I had spoken the words about being in relationship with land and being in community. And it wasn't until this experience, one, of being part of a collective. So the collective of Earthseed has been around for 12 years, but we have been on land for 8.5 years. And it's only through the daily practice of being in listening mode, of returning to the land, of humbling myself before the trees, of really like tuning in to a different level of listening, that this sense, my glimpses, it's not even that I know what it means to live a life, a liberated life, but my glimpses of liberation have only come through being in that kind of relationship with this particular place. I understand that for many of us, especially those of us that are immigrants or that have lived in different lands that aren't indigenous to a place, that sometimes we struggle to understand what it means to build intimate relationship with a place. And it wasn't until this moment in my life, in this relationship with this particular 48 acres of land, that I'm just beginning to touch into what it means to aspire to liberation. It still feels like an aspiration. And it's been one of the most challenging things I've done as well. It's not all romantic. It's not all roses. It's definitely a lot of work. We humans are complex creatures, and we each bring our baggage and our egos. And so recommitting myself to the collective, to the practice, to the land has meant everything to me, has defined me as a human in ways that is still surprising and still feels like the gifts keep appearing. And especially now, as we continue to see the unraveling of these systems and we continue to experience human created violence at these monumental levels and these patterns of hate and destruction that we are just committed to recreating, that returning to that relationship to land, returning my feet to the earth feels like I would have lost my sanity without that as my source of strength, as my source of connection.
I'm curious if for you, in thinking about some of these connections, if there's standout experiences from the program that have really just stayed with you.
Yeah, I mean, a few. When the chief, in one of his opening sessions with us, spoke precisely to this, went straight to the heart and was like, your feet on this earth was the truth that he was delivering. And first of all, it was affirming for me to hear that. It's like it penetrates all of these different like branches to get to like this core truth that indigenous people across this planet have been very clear about and trying to remind us of. And so to have this chief from a different lineage that is not my own also come back to that truth from an early moment felt really important to me. And then you're not going to be surprised to hear, but the Hero, where we went to the ceremony.
Ile Ashe Apo Afonja in Praia de Forchi.
Yeah, that evening, if I like allow myself to tap into that moment, the power of it still reverberates in my body, because it was the moment where I was like, oh, it's collective embodied devotion, like part of the formula, right? So there is this connection to the earth. And then another one of those truths that felt like so clear to me in that moment was around collective embodied devotion, and that our people have been doing it in so many different ways, right? Bomba is one of those practices of collective embodied devotion. And that I have felt called to it, like, oh, it just feels, it's good medicine, but to understand that as well as part of the core teachings was monumental to me in that moment. That evening and that experience and what it did in my body and embracing of it that I experienced at a cellular level has definitely stuck with me.
I definitely appreciate that, because I feel like what we were able to bear witness to and to be in community with and to be in space with energetically, on a vibrational level, on an ancestral level, were once in a lifetime kind of experiences. And many times, a lot of the spirit work that is those moments, even if you do another ceremony for an Orisha or another event, a commemoration, the energies that come through in that moment don't necessarily appear in that same configuration ever again. I want to turn us to this other question that is thinking about these times and this practice of collective embodiment and our relationship with land. How do we tap into some of these practices or pillars and beliefs collectively and equip ourselves for what's to come? That's a huge question that a lot of folks are having in political movement and also in spiritual spaces. What do we need to do to prepare? And I'm just curious what you're seeing right now, what you're in conversation about.
Ooh, that's a big old question. What do we need to do to prepare? I love that you named the singular moment in time magic of that experience, because for me, that was also heightened because of the realization that I'm not going to be doing a lot more of that travel. I don't plan to in my life. And so what that highlights for me is that I am choosing a path of hyper locality, hyper localized existence, very intentionally. So the question for me is, how do I bring these practices home and then keep them alive in a way that feels true to their root and not watered down? Is very much the learning edge for me. Because for those of you who are practitioners in specific lineages, bringing these practices to social justice spaces or to facilitations feels like, I imagine it's more like an integrity because it is part of the lineage that you are committing your life to. And then the question for those of us who aren't part of those lineages, but can see the power and the need and the beauty of these practices, how can we do it again without teetering over the edge into appropriation or into a watered down version of what the practice is intended to be? It's still a conundrum in my head. Like the other day, I was facilitating a group at Earthseed, and this is a nonprofit that is in our area that works with refugees, and they so appreciated being on the land. And I always do a land acknowledgement. We always do some kind of grounding practice on the land. And I had this question going into that, pouring libations. Would pouring libations make sense for this kind of group where they're representing refugees from different parts of the world, aren't necessarily practicing any specific spiritual tradition? And would pouring libations feel like a overreaching, or would it feel like something that is right? And so what I ended up doing was found another way to honor ancestors through the grounding practice without going into this territory that felt like, I don't know if I could claim this as my own. So that's just one small example of those kinds of questions.
It's a great question to ask because there is kind of this piece around what makes sense not only for the facilitator or host of a space, but also for the folks who are invited to be part of that space, right? What is the real relationship that we can have between our movements and some of these spiritual traditions? And obviously, depending on folks' individual or collective lineages, entire communities that understand that, yes, we come from a maroon lineage and we have a cultural sense of what resonates spiritually with us, whether that's, voodoo for Haitian folks or regla de ocha for Cubans or folks who are part of the diaspora. But, we also have examples of liberation theology. And there is something really interesting about this moment and what's possible and what makes sense, what fits. What is this moment calling for?
The other living question connected to that for me as well is, what is the work that we need to do to decenter humans in those conversations as well, because I think I mentioned this while we were in Brazil, that part of my resistance and kind of like skepticism to any lineage that requires human intervention is that my spiritual practice has been one of going directly to the source, which to me, the source is the living earth, mother goddess, this, whatever you want to call it, Gaia. And that as soon as we start bringing in the requirements of human interventions and the filter of human mind and human interpretation, that something gets distorted. And so in these conversations about how to make the connections between these ancient technologies and how to keep them alive and how to tap into their power in our current reality, that layer for me is also an important one without necessitating this sort of human filter, human leadership, human guru to interpret as the go-between.
It's like all the traditions have this deep source connection. You said earlier, like what's at the core, like this core connection with earth and like universe and universal energy. And human beings are messy. We're very messy. And we came to learn a lot from not just each other, but from everything else, both seen and unseen. So I think that is a really great intervention and invitation as well for folks to think through and to sit with. It reminds me of what you mentioned earlier around sitting or being with nature and also having those lessons and observations come through in as much of a, I imagine, close to less filtered way.
So the word that I used was apprenticeship. So I've been apprenticing with the trees, and I believe in the apprenticeship modality, right? So this is not to take away from the power of having a teacher, a trusted advisor, especially for those of us who are early on in our spiritual journeys, right? Because I still consider myself to be early on in my spiritual journey. And it's the weird sort of elevation that happens, or the hierarchy that happens within organized religion, for sure, the one that I grew up in, and some of these other lineages that I've been exposed to, that always gives me a little bit of pause.
Hi, this is Francisca Pochas Coronado, and I want to offer you today libations. Libations are an age-old practice used by many indigenous peoples across the globe. It is the act of pouring cool water or alcohol on the earth and ground to invoke coolness in our spaces and in ourselves. Libations can be done before a ritual or a conversation, whether at a protest or in your home, your office, in a meeting or before a meeting, other spaces that may be part of your daily life or community space, or any event. Libations are typically done before any major thing happens because it brings coolness to the situation or to the space. The concept of coolness is important. Water is life. And we are water, and our world is water. Water is of major importance to all living things. In some organisms, it can be up to 90% of the body weight, and up to 60% of the human adult body is water. The earth is 71% water. The concept of coolness is integral to the delicate balance of our planet. The rise of 1 to 2 degrees in temperature of the world's oceans that holds 90% of the Earth's water has been catastrophic thus far. We've seen hurricanes, we've seen major flooding events, melting ice caps, tornadoes, and many other catastrophes. Similarly, when we get hot-headed as individuals or lose our cool, we don't think clearly. We allow emotional challenges to take over, such as anxiety, anger, frustration, self-doubt. We must maintain our own coolness to think clearly, calmly, and strategically, and for our own well-being and that of the collective, and that of our environment.
Thank you for joining us today on Spirit and Liberation, brought to you by the Latinx Therapist Action Network. And a special thank you to Zulayka Santiago for sharing with us the way she listens and learns from Mother Earth. If this episode spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone in your circle. Spirit and Liberation is hosted by Francisca Porchas Coronado and Jeanette Charles Marquez. Today's episode was produced and edited by Phil Circus.